very skeptical. So this gentleman, I'll let you know who he is in a minute, suggested I read this book called Gaming the Vote by William Poundstone. It's available on Amazon for $10 to $12. I have several copies that I give to students to learn about it. I'd be willing to share those with the committee members if they want one. This book turned me on to the concept of approval voting, and I called this gentleman back up 2 days later and says, hey, how can I help? And I've been fighting for approval voting ever since. His name is Frank Atwood. Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate it. I have lots of stories to tell, and I won't bore you with many, many stories, but I will tell you one. I was addressing a group of students in the last couple of years, and as I have my back turned to the audience, writing on the whiteboard, one young lady says, why isn't this already a thing? So I ask you, is Denver going to join Fargo and St. Louis in adopting approval voting? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Blake, and I'm happy to announce you have about 10 seconds left. So good job at 1 minute and 50 seconds. With that, I want to thank all of our speakers here today, and I am going to open it up now to questions from our committee members.
Dan, I had my hand up for the last 15 minutes. Can I go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that.
Thank you. And the reason for that is I am actually hosting a Zoom meeting, and I'll have to leave before the top of the hour, so I'll have to leave ahead of time. Just a couple of observations. And at the end of the presentation, why not? I don't think why not is a good question to ask, it because it reminds me of Donald Trump when he was trying to cozy up to voters of color when he said, why not vote for me? What the hell do you have to lose? And I think we found out. So I don't think why not is a good question. Why is the question? And just to respond a little bit to Marty, and I appreciate his comments about St. Louis, but I do want to ask what is not working. I don't want to just change because there's something new out there. As far as we know, right now the only actual problem that we have in our system, the legal problem, as opposed to a policy debate about what might be better or better than what we're doing now, the only real problem we have right now is the deadline issue with the overseas and military absentee ballot deadlines versus our runoff. So one thing I wanted to ask was, in St. Louis, according to the presentation, you're having your election on March 2nd, and then your runoff is April 6th, and that's only 5 weeks.
Yeah.
So how do you comply with the overseas and military absentee voting deadline?
Well, I can't personally speak to how they'll handle that, because irrespective of if we didn't have approval voting, that would still be the date for our municipal election. That's just how it's set up in the charter. So if anything, we've launched a major campaign to really just turn around to remind and inform the citizens of St. Louis, and say, make sure you have to vote twice. The rules have changed. We have approval voting now.
Right.
So, from a perspective of how do you account for those ballots that have to be sent in, I think it's one that the candidates have to kind of echo that, because you have to remind your voters, hey, vote for me now and vote for me again. I've seen a lot of candidates kind of using that as part of their platform. Your commentary around don't tell me why not, tell me why. A lot of, certainly the history, right? But what we've been struggling with here in the city of St. Louis is we have political machines, right, that have been in power for decades. And a lot of times, the more like our city has been getting held back, whenever we see very progressive issues come to the ballot or progressive candidates run, and in that 2017 race, we had one of the most progressive candidates that we've seen for mayor in the past 2 decades, right? So with that loss and with that the machine being used in a way to kind of silence those voices, it kind of echoed it even louder that we need to change this. But to your point of why should we do it? Like I say, I've seen the benefits already, right? Like the negative attack ads, because candidates you can't bash another candidate. One, you'll turn off voters, but then after that first election, the candidates have to be nice to each other because they want to get the support of the other candidates. So you won't see that I haven't seen it too much. I've seen a little bit of bickering back and forth, but we haven't seen a lot of nasty commentary, and it really has been focused around vote for me because I'm different than these candidates, as opposed to don't vote for these other candidates.
I'd like to ask then, because we have the same, we have a runoff that's a month later. So I would like to find out, and I understand that you don't have an answer right now, but I would like to find out how you are handling the overseas military ballot absentee voting deadline issue. So that's the only real thing that we need to solve with this effort, and everything else is just, while we're doing that, why don't we look at all these other things? So what would happen in your runoff? The example that was given was you had 3 candidates, and there's or 4 candidates, Jerry Jobs and Helen Healthcare and all that, and then in the runoff there are 2, right? What would happen under approval voting when you have a runoff later? Should one of those candidates achieve more than 50% plus 1 of total voters? 100 voters cast ballots, 51 of them voted for Helen Healthcare. Would you still have a runoff under this system?
So, Kevin, that's a great question. Oh, I'm sorry, Marty. Did you want to answer that?
You can speak to. I think you can speak to it from the technical response, because I know you all were working pretty heavily in trying to coordinate with the Board of Aldermen. I like the idea of 50 plus 1, allowing it to be that being the definitive. Let's not have a runoff.
Right.
Only for the instance of cost and funding an entire election, when that's clearly a mandate from the voters. So I'm not certain that our measure had that baked into it, but I think that would be a good consideration.
Exactly.
It could be the case that Helen Healthcare got 52% of the vote. You nevertheless go to a runoff, and then she loses, just because of the dynamics of the next 5 weeks. Something might happen, and suddenly people don't want to vote for her anymore, right?
That is absolutely true. Kevin, this gets to part of what I said earlier, which is for the future of elections in St. Louis, the most important part that we want is approval voting, because we capped the current election dates where it's, a month apart, the general election after the primary. We just changed it to a runoff general election. And that because with approval voting, you could have one candidate with 60% and another one with 59.9%. Right. You can have multiple with a majority. So we just said the top 2 go to runoff. But I think what we will find in St. Louis after some election cycles is that generally whoever performs the best in the primary is also going to end up being the winner in the general. The nice thing about approval voting is you actually could, in theory, get rid of the 2 elections and move to 1 if you really wanted to, and because it avoids a lot of the vote splitting issues of the current choose 1 method, and also, frankly, even of ranked choice voting. Approval voting gives you the clearest picture of the electorate, even just from 1 election. So that is something you could go. I would say no matter what you do, though, from our perspective, approval voting is just the key piece of the whole puzzle.
Okay, thank you. I guess just the last thing I would add, and I'll stay until I have to leave to start my other meeting. But in Denver, I wanted to point out that squash would not have won in Denver because we don't have plurality voting. We haven't used plurality voting in more than 100 years, other than at large for council. So when you said that both ranked choice and approval voting are improvements over plurality, I would agree. But we don't do that. We're not changing from a plurality system like the state of Maine did when they went to ranked choice. We already have a system that produces a true majority winner. So with that, I will listen to the rest of the meeting. I'll probably have to leave it about 7 minutes before. Thank you, Clerk Lopez.
Grace private messaged me. I'm sorry, I didn't answer the main question you asked, Andy, which was the why. If things don't seem broken, why fix it? What I will say is, in St. Louis, the major elections that had, like Marty said, stalking horse candidates were decades apart, even though in between there were various elections that had some of the vote splitting or other issues that were just more under the radar. But even though, you generally would have had the same winners under a plurality system versus an approval voting system in a lot of those elections, moving proactively to something like approval voting can prevent the kind of incredible breach of trust that felt like happened in St. Louis when we had a particularly strange election result in 2017. So frankly, if we could probably go back in time, we would have rather put that into place before we had a major breakdown of trust and mandate to lead in our city.
Okay. Oh, I do have actually one other request. I saw the synopsis of the poll and the methods and everything. Would you be willing to send us the actual poll with the crosstabs and everything else? And then my other data request is send me some clips or some background on this 2017 election. I'd like to hear more about it. I'm a retired journalist, so I know.
And Councilman, I think I can take a stab at attempting to answer your question about why St. Louis doesn't have the same problem.
Oh, I see that. Thank you.
Oh yeah. So our problem is actually kind of unique a little bit because, the military and overseas, the federal act generally governs elections for federal office. What we've done is we have our state law that has copied federal law, and then our charter provision tells us to follow the state election law. So we've kind of had this trickle-down effect that impacts us, and it might just not impact St. Louis in the same way.
I see. Okay, I recall that discussion. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, just checking, Stephanie, did that answer your question that you posted in chat, or would you like additional follow-up on the context of the change in voting model post the 2017 election?
No, it was answered. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Professor Cummings.
Thanks. So I'm impressed by these arguments for approval voting. I just think of one problem compared to ranked choice voting. Under approval voting, if I understand it correctly, when I am voting my approval of, let's say, 3 out of 8 candidates, I'm not allowed to show that of those 3, I prefer one to the other to the other. I have to kind of it's kind of like false equivalence in a way. I approve of them, but I have no opportunity to say that I approve of one more than the other. Whereas under ranked choice voting, I can say, this is my first, this is my second, this is my third. So those of you that support approval voting, could you just address this problem? I see it as a bit of a problem, at least potentially, that I don't get to say which is my favorite, which is my second, which is my third. I just have to say, well, I just approve these 3, period.
And I'll certainly let him kind of speak to it. I know the first thing, once it passed, I immediately got with the candidate that I'm for. And I would say the closest thing we would have under that model would be bullet voting, whereas I don't vote for any other candidates, but just vote for the one candidate that I think is the best. I think that'd probably be the closest thing that would get us to that. How do you differentiate between preference under that model? But I'll certainly let Benjamin or Chris kind of speak to how do we address that with approval.
Yeah, Michael, we actively considered that exact same question while figuring out what the best policy would be with policy experts, election administrators, and community leaders. And that was part of why we left the election dates in place, because it gives you a chance to pick between the top 2 candidates who have the most support. Whereas with the system that was before, you end up picking between candidates who didn't necessarily have the broadest support. The issue with doing ranked choice voting is that, so we had many races in St. Louis, or multiple at least, where you would end up with the top 3 candidates each getting about a third of the vote. And an approval voting system in a situation like that gives you a much clearer picture of who the actual top 2 leading supporters are, versus ranked choice voting, where it can end up being kind of arbitrary, and you can end up with a consensus candidate as the one who gets left out of a runoff. I heard the podcast that Aaron did on 80,000 Hours was how we learned about approval voting, and some of the examples he gave about how those consensus candidates get squeezed out in just runoff systems that don't have approval voting. Very scary and very compelling.
Thank you.
I can maybe add a little bit more. So I think one of the fundamental questions here is the voting method doing a good job in measuring support for all the candidates? So when you're looking at the totals, is the total support for all the candidates accurate? given the inputs from every individual voter. And fortunately, that's an empirical question, and we've tested that explicitly. We did that as recent. So we did that in the 2016 election, we did that in the 2020 election, and we also did it in the primaries for the Democratic primary. And what we did there is we asked respondents how they would vote under different voting methods. And then in addition to that, we had control measures where we could say, okay, well, how accurate are these voting methods getting to the true support in actuality? And approval voting did an excellent job mirroring the control measure support. So when we asked people just to give an honest assessment of each individual candidate, approval voting did a good job of mirroring that. Instant runoff voting actually did not do a very good job of that. And the reason for that is because, one, when you have ranking information, there's no clear threshold for when you approve of a candidate or when you don't approve of a candidate, or you don't approve of a candidate. That's just something that's inherent with an ordinal type measurement. The other issue is that the ranked choice voting method, it ignores a lot of ballot data. So when you look at candidates who are make it into later rounds, if candidates that support those candidates have later choice preferences, those later choice preferences never even are acknowledged in the whole counting process because those candidates have already been eliminated. And then another issue is that because of this kind of arbitrary elimination process, you can have candidates who have a lot of support, but they can split first choice preferences, which can artificially knock them out earlier in the race. We saw that in Burlington, Vermont in 2009, which later repealed RCD, and we've seen it in other elections that use kind of traditional runoffs. One famous one is the 1991 gubernatorial election in Louisiana, where a moderate candidate was knocked out, and you had two very extreme candidates run in that election. One a Klansman, and then another who was a corrupt politician that would later go to jail for felonies committed in office. But that kind of vote splitting dynamic can occur even when you do rankings, where it's approval voting allowing you to select as many as you want. It allows voters to kind of hedge their bets and center around that more consensus style candidate.
Thank you.
Clerk Lopez, then Mark Ruskin.
Thank you, Andy. I got a question. So one of the things I've read about this particular model is that although it does give folks a choice, right, and you're able to go in and pick the candidates that you like, oftentimes in elections you see that necessarily isn't usually the case, where people will maybe pick one or two and are, have one or two candidates that they really like in a race, even though there's a lot of different ones out there. Then you'll have folks that like one candidate, right? And they're in it and they're loyal to that one candidate, right? And they're working on their behalf, and that's their person. They're going to vote for that one candidate, and it doesn't require you to mark more than one. It just allows you to mark more, right? And I think one of the concerns is the dilemma that it creates is if folks like two of those candidates, let's say there's 9 candidates in the race, and they like 2 of them, they mark 2 of them, right? Then there becomes a dilemma as, do they also like maybe one more than the other? Then there's a dilemma in which the top choice may not make it. That true top choice that they really like may not make it because they filled in more than one circle. That creates a little bit of an issue for folks in terms of a calculated political risk for them by virtue of their vote. They may just want to just click that one candidate, which would kind of take us all the way back to simple plurality, right? Can you address that? I mean, have you seen that? Both Honorable Murray and then also Chris and some of the advocates. Have we seen that in some of these other elections? The kind of dilemma effect?
So the election that we've seen so far in Fargo, North Dakota, it had 2.3 votes per ballot. And what we see with research is as the number of candidates increases, the number of votes per ballot also increases. And that's something I think that we would expect just rather intuitively. Also, it's important to note that who would benefit the most from being able to support multiple candidates. And particularly some of the issues that we're seeing here, a lot of people from minority groups are the ones who have the most to gain here by avoiding their votes being split from within their community. And so perhaps we want to draw a little bit of attention of who might be hurt the most by putting that restriction on them. And it doesn't take a lot of people supporting more than one candidate. So you can have an election where even 60 or 70% of people only choose one candidate. If, say, you have only 4 or 5 candidates in the field running. But even having 30% of people choose more than one candidate, that's enough to be material in terms of, one, potentially changing the outcome of the election for the better, because margin of victory are often much less than 30%. And then the other issue is making sure that even if the winner doesn't change, because changing the voting method doesn't always change the winner, making sure that the person who wins is able to win with the true amount of support, so that they don't have so that they're able to actually go forward and lead with the mandate. And then the other component being that even for candidates who don't win, making sure that they get their due, including making sure that if that comes from a minority group, that they aren't artificially marginalized as well. And even with just a few, like 30% of people support multiple candidates, we're able to see that reflection.
I'd be curious to see that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Benjamin.
No, I'm sorry for interrupting, Clerk. I mean, for me, when I think about some of the questions that you and Michael just asked, it's wanting to support your favorite candidate that is one of the best reasons to support approval voting. When I was first learning about it, there was something Aaron would say all the time that it took me a while to understand. He would say approval voting is one of, or the only voting method where it never hurts you to vote for your honest favorite candidate. And what I realized he meant by that is that with ranked choice voting, well, first of all, with plurality voting, if you are going to vote for like a Ralph Nader, I mean, we know what happens. With ranked choice voting, what I didn't realize is if you rank your Ralph Nader first, or your Jill Stein or Bernie or whatever it is, and then you rank, your compromise candidate second, you actually can end up forcing both of them to lose, because whoever has the least first place votes is eliminated, and then votes are reallocated, and you can end up sending your support to the person who you actually support the least. It's crazy. There's some great videos about it that I would recommend. But approval voting is the one where by voting for your favorite candidate, you're always giving them a better chance to win because they're your favorite. It doesn't hurt your favorite candidate to vote for them. I know it might take a little bit to understand that, but I think it's a super important point that I didn't at first realize when we were considering ranked choice voting versus approval voting, but I'm really happy we went with approval voting for that exact reason.
So I just want to make sure we get to Mr. Gruskin's question now that we're getting close to 4. So, Mr. Gruskin.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the presentations that were made. They're very enlightening. I actually have 3 questions that are unrelated. So, first, what sort of education program did the City of St. Louis do so that voters understood exactly what the revised system that they were being asked to take was? Second, what sort of tactics do campaigns use in order to get either one more voters to add one more preferred candidate, or to try and dissuade voters from adding to their list of acceptable voters? And finally, in the second election that is held, are there write-in options that are possible?
I will answer just very briefly the tactics question. I'll let the St. Louis folks talk about that. Every voting method has tactics. Every one. There's no way of getting around it. I plain believe that's part of the voter's expression, right? The voter should be able to maximize their impact any way they see fit. To answer Clerk Lopez's question a little bit, it's still a vote. It's still a vote. It still has the weight, the full weight and power of a vote. But at the end of the day, we should give that power to the voter. Now that's just for the tactics. I know Aaron has a lot more actual specific academic, but that from just kind of a campaign strategy, it's a game of addition. Really, the only way to win is to go out and make sure you are approved by the most people. There's no other fluky ways like with vote splitting to win. So for the ballot, there is tactics, but there's tactics for every method. But at the end of the day, if there's tactics, the only thing that should matter is that at least people should be able to vote for their favorite, and it never hurts them.
Yeah, and then Benjamin put some information as far as like how they approach informing the voters in the chat. But the only thing I'll just add to that is when you look at the diversity of the individuals and organizations that were championing this initiative, it was kind of across the political spectrum, because it was less about candidates or ideology and just more about how do we make sure voters are heard. Everybody was kind of championing that through the entire campaign as far as the supporters.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up too. You know, part of the strategy with our timing is we wanted something on the ballot November 2021, so that if the voters do approve something, we have about just shy of 2 years to communicate that change. And the clerk has brought in an engagement team for our office, and I'm sure it would be their primary directive for about 1.5 years before any sort of changes implemented. With that being said, Mr. Gruskin, did you get all of your questions answered, or okay? Just wanted to make sure. So what we can do is we'll follow up if committee members have questions in writing, and we can just coordinate everything, make sure everyone gets a response. We don't want to leave anyone hanging, obviously, but thank you all very, very much for speaking with us today, for presenting today. We greatly appreciate it. I think we've had a lot of good discussion here. And if you have anything at all, please just let us know. And as always, with the charter clerk email address, anything that goes there will be sent directly to committee members. So thank you all very, very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Hey folks, still hanging out at the CO Masquerade offices, making calls, doing video, trying to get some masks out into the world. Thanks for joining us today. We continue to push for methodologies that are beneficial to all in our community. And I'm producing way much more to video than I need to today. Don't forget to check out my new page, Seeking Justice. This will get changed here soon enough, so we'll go from there. Thanks. Talk to you later.